Greetings, Starfighter. You have been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Zur and the Kodan Armada.
I invent the game, find the kid, drag him up there, and he doesn't want to be a starfighter. I give up.
Terrific. I'm about to get killed a million miles from nowhere with a gung-ho iguana who tells me to relax. There's no fleet, no starfighters, no plan. One ship, you, me, and that's it?
Exactly.
What the hell's going on?
Louis, you're having a terrible nightmare.
50 years ago, an alien force known as the Formics attacked Earth. Tens of millions died.
How'd you like to lead your own army?
I think it's impossible to truly understand someone and not love them the way they love themselves.
I thought you were a teacher. There is no teacher but the enemy.
Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi, with me, James.
And me, Matt. Every series on this podcast, we explore the world of science fiction cinema by taking a trip through a different subgenre of sci-fi.
This series, our journey is through the fantastical world of space opera. Welcome back, listeners. We have returned from our brief hiatus. We are fresh from our summer holidays and we are back on the space opera bandwagon, ready to deliver you a brand new episode of Journey Through Sci-Fi content. It's been a little while, hasn't it, Matt?
Yeah, it's been a hot summer on Arrakis for me, James. I had a
Has it been a hot boy summer on Arrakis?
Yeah. I did some spice over there, and I've seen things that no one should see. But as you can see, I've got a lovely tan, so it all kind of balances out in the end. Yes,
a very healthy glow on you, I must say.
Thank you very much.
So we have reconvened. We are back on the podcast again. And this week we are looking at the theme of video games and battles in space. I like that because it's kind of got a bit of a ring to it.
Yeah. Video games and battles in space. Lovely, yeah.
Yeah, and it does what it says on the tin. Both of the films we're looking at today basically do that, don't they?
Yeah, we've got some straight up video games and more gamification of space battles, but they both deal with gaming and how it relates to fighting and space combat. They treat them in really different ways, and that's going to be interesting to talk about because I think that the tone of that conversation has changed a lot between when these films were made. So it'll be interesting to see how they're handled.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is a real shift that you feel between these two films, but we will get into that. But what are the films that we're covering this week then, Matt?
So up first, we have The Last Starfighter from 1984, directed by Nick Castle. And second, we have Ender's Game from 2013, directed by Gavin Hood. Based, of course, on the novel by Orson Scott Card.
Yeah, quite a combination this week. They're two very different films in terms of feel, but do have that similar theme with the video games and battles in space going on. But one of the things I was thinking about as well before we got into this is, have you ever played a video game and imagined like it was happening in real time? And we talked about Halo over on Patreon recently, but have there ever been any video games you've played kind of space opera-y where you've been like, wow, it'd be cool to experience this in real life? Or is it just too dangerous? You don't want to be any part of it?
Not in a literal sense, not in the kind of Last Starfighter, or certainly not in the Ender's Game. Actually, no, maybe not in the Last Starfighter way where it's like a fantasy that could potentially come true and I want it to come true. But we'll get into it in Ender's Game, but there's something about the immediacy of the experience of gaming that Ender is going through in Ender's Game that actually I find more relatable. I don't think I've ever been playing a game and like thought that it was real, but the better the game and the more immersive it is, then you can get locked into that feeling pretty easily when the game is good. And Halo is a great example of that, Halo Online.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't really think about the immersion of games, but both of these films do show their main protagonists getting immersed in the video games that have spawned these realities for them in one way or another. So, shall we get cracking and start with our conversation on The Last Starfighter then?
Yes, let's dive straight into Last Starfighter from 1984.
I hope you've got enough quarters for this video game.
I'll have to break a note.
Alex Rogan had a dream.
You really are leaving here, aren't you?
To be as far away from here as possible.
You get your chance.
when it comes, you gotta grab it with both hands.
It started with a game.
You gonna bust the record!
But it wasn't just any game.
You have been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Zur and the Kodan Armada.
And then, one night...
Centauri's the name. We have to talk about a matter of utmost importance. Step into my office. I've seen him come and I've seen him go, but you're the best, my boy. Light years ahead of the competition.
Hey.
Alex didn't find his dream.
Hey, look out! Oh, dear.
His dream found him.
So The Last Starfighter from 1984, directed by Nick Castle and written by Jonathan R. Butel. Nick Castle, obviously we know him because he was the original Michael Myers, wasn't he? He was the man himself from Halloween.
Or more relevant to our interests here, James, he was the beach ball alien in Dark Star, squelching around the ship.
Oh, yes. I forgot about that. The fact he was the beach ball alien. I mean, Dark Star, what an amazing film. And that film, that sci-fi film, was the breeding ground for so many great people, which we've discussed on the podcast before. Obviously, John Carpenter, but also Dan O'Bannon. And now we're talking about Nick Castle in his directorial mode for this film.
Now, I didn't know that. That's a lovely legacy, not legacy, but a lovely heritage for Nick Castle. His legacy is this film, in my eyes. I didn't know any of that about Nick Castle before researching for today. For me, Nick Castle is the director of Last Starfighter, because Last Starfighter is an iconic childhood movie for me. This is one of the ultimate rainy day movies for me. And I don't know why there's so many space opera movies fall into that category, but I'm realizing that space opera films were a big part of my, what turned me on to sci-fi when I was a kid, like Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, Star Wars. Last Starfighter seemed to always be on a bank holiday. That's my memory of it. I saw it so many times when I was a kid. Did you catch this one on bank holidays and rainy Sundays?
Yeah, it was always on, wasn't it? But I think for me, it was on one of those films which I would only catch halfway through every time.
Sure, yeah.
And it eluded me for so long. I wanted to watch this film in its entirety, but it would always be, I catch the end of it, I catch a bit in the middle, and then we have to go out somewhere, or I can't watch the entirety of this film. So when I finally got to sit down and properly watch it, it was quite the experience. But you talking about rainy day films as well, I think Nick Castle's other films that he's written as well kind of fit into that category for me. There's Hook. Obviously, he wrote Hook, or he's one of the writers on Hook. The Boy Who Could Fly. That feels like very much one of those kind of rerun films that they would show on the weekends and that kind of thing. And yeah, I think it's an interesting thing that he's got that kind of nostalgia around him because of making these films, which had a more it was more child-friendly audience in mind around about the 80s, which is obviously why we've got that connection to them.
Yeah, and I remember it being family-friendly, child-friendly, because I saw it when I was very young. I was a little bit surprised rewatching it by how serious it is at times. There's real jeopardy. It never kind of loses sight of the space opera fantasy side of things, which keeps things light in tone. But I mean, to be frank, like, he's the last Starfighter because all of his compatriots are wiped out in a massive attack about halfway through the movie, which is pretty heavy stuff. And there's this threat that's it's not just this sort of fantasy space battle. It's like the evil empire is marching towards Earth as well. So all of your new compatriots that you've just met have been wiped out, and also your family's going to die unless you come back and fight in this war that you never signed up for. Pretty dark stuff.
Yeah, and it doesn't really frame itself in that way when you think of it as a kid.
No, not at all.
Yeah, you always just look at it as like, oh, he's playing a fun video game and he's going on an adventure. But there's some dark undertones as to what's actually going on in this, isn't there?
Yeah, it caught me off guard. But like I said, the tone throughout the film is kind of perfectly pitched space opera stuff, isn't it? It's a breezy film.
Yeah, definitely. It is very breezy. It's a bit light on some of the more in-depth story elements, but it's a bit of a romp, isn't it? It's a fun adventure film aimed at kids with that adult tinge to it.
Yeah, so I've given away a bit of the story. What is the story overall then?
Well, the main premise of the film is you've got this character, this teenager, Alex Rogan, who lives on a trailer park, and he's always doing odd jobs for people around the trailer park, and he feels like he's stuck. He is stuck in this humdrum lifestyle. He's trying to find a way out. He's trying to get out of his current life situation. And he's always playing this one arcade game called Starfighter. And one day he's playing this game, he gets the high score, and then pretty soon this mysterious games designer, Centauri, comes around. To cut a long story short, he ends up going to space and having to fight an intergalactic battle against this evil empire that is threatening the world. So yeah, that's the sort of long and short of it, isn't it?
Yeah, the game that he's playing is a recruitment device for this alliance of planets fighting against the evil empire encroaching onto their peaceful territories. It's the ultimate. It's one of the ultimate nerdy kid fantasies, isn't it? That you may be recruited to go off and be this fantastical space adventurer. There are other similarities to Tron. There are many similarities to Tron that we'll touch on, but that central premise of kind of playing a game and getting sucked into an exciting adventure literally through the game is very similar to Tron, isn't it?
Yeah, and it feels like there's that idea of the video game being the testing ground for becoming something greater that we've seen in other stuff as well. We saw it was a bit in Ready Player One as well in some aspects, because there was in Ready Player One, you've got that character who is playing in this video game world continuously, and he gets really good at it, and he finds out the big secret and so on and so forth. And you've got it in other stuff. Like, I was thinking about the new Gran Turismo film as well.
Oh yeah.
Because that has a similar kind of idea in that, I haven't seen that yet, but it's directed by Neil Blomkamp. It's just come out. And in that, you've got a kid who is playing video games in his room. He's playing Gran Turismo, and then he gets this opportunity to become a proper racing driver through this big competition that's happening, and they're testing this thing to see if video gamers can become proper racers. And it's the same kind of thing with The Last Starfighter, isn't it? Except he's playing a arcade game in his trailer park, and it's going to end up in a intergalactic battle.
Yeah, except I think I haven't seen Gran Turismo either yet, but I think that it is exactly the same premise, but like a deeply uninteresting version of the premise that he
scathing.
I don't know. It's just like it's so strange.
You're not interested.
It's been so heavily promoted as it being based on a true story, as if that makes it more interesting because it really happened. But I just can't get myself excited about someone who plays a racing video game then becoming a racing driver, compared to, especially by comparison. You're right, it's the exact same premise as Last Starfighter, but the stakes just seem so much lower. Well, they are lower. Like, Alex goes off to fight an intergalactic war, and this kid's going to become a racing driver. It's just...
But he could die in the racing driving seat.
Yes, but James, he doesn't have to be a racing driver, does he?
Yeah, that's true. He doesn't. He doesn't. I mean, yeah, it's definitely that. But you making the Tron comparison is bang on the money as well. It came out at sort of a similar time. I think Tron was out before, wasn't it?
Yeah, maybe a year in it or two.
Yeah, and this also utilises the same digital effects team. I think they're called Digital Effects, the guys which did the special effects for this. You've got that tinge to it. It looks like Tron. It's using CGI and 3D rendered spaceship models to create these battles in space that we're seeing. And that's different to what we've seen in a lot of the other space opera films, because it was very much... The thing that you would do is you would create your spaceships with real life models, just like Star Wars and everything that came before it.
Yeah.
that's how you would do it. So this is kind of like an exception to the rule around about this time, but it also is kind of paving the way for that future CGI spaceship model, which would become the norm.
How do you think it looks now, watching it back? And what do you remember how you felt about those scenes when you were younger?
I don't think I ever really clocked it when I was younger. It just felt like part of the film. And I think even watching it now, even though the CGI looks dated, I think it still works with the world of the film, because it is supposed to be like a video game. So it kind of makes sense that these spaceships look a bit like a video game as well. So they kind of work thematically for me.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. That wasn't how I reacted to it watching it now, but it sort of has a justification along those lines, doesn't it? I remember thinking it looked incredibly cool when I was young. I just thought it was a very cool looking film, and I loved all the space action scenes. But probably for that reason, because it looked like a video game, and I like video games. I think watching it back now, I think it looks incredibly dated, obviously. But I think that's kind of a shame, because I think other aspects of the film have aged incredibly well. The creature design, like the aliens, look great, just as good as anything in Star Wars, in my opinion. The beta Alex looks amazing in one horrifying scene where he's first changing into a replica of Alex, and obviously all of that is using practical effects. So I just thought it was a bit of a shame. I don't think you could show this film to someone who hadn't seen it and expect them to be as wowed by it as they would be maybe watching Star Wars for the first time. And not, there's lots of other things about Star Wars to love, but it still looks fantastic, and it's aged really well special effects wise. Whereas this has a bit of an albatross of special effects, unfortunately. So it's technologically commendable to be one of these first films using CGI in this way, but it has aged it. And also by comparison to Tron, so what you were saying about the kind of video game aesthetic working in this film, I think that unquestionably works better in Tron, because they literally physically are going inside of a video game. So looking like a video game is even more thematically justifiable in Tron. So that film, I think, has aged a lot better than this one, sadly, even though I still think it's very good.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? Because it does feel like it takes a few missteps in some ways, because when I was rewatching this, there were moments where I've got to say, I kind of lost interest in a few bits. I don't know if it was the pacing of the film, or if I wasn't getting enough of the sort of the Last Starfighter aspect. There wasn't enough of the I am fighting this big battle. There's a lot of reluctant hero moments, which kind of take place throughout a lot of the film, because there's a whole bit. He goes off into space. He's out there. He's gonna become a starfighter. He's gonna be this great hero. But as with most space operas and most sort of sci-fis where you've got a young protagonist, there is that reluctant hero moment, and it's Shinji and Evangelion. It's all of that kind of stuff where, like, oh no, I don't want to do this, even though I'm piloting a cool robot or I'm flying a great spaceship. No, I'm not going to do this, even though I really want to, kind of thing. It's that kind of conflict that's happening, which I think I've seen so many times. Sometimes it grates a little bit.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
It's probably a bit unfair, but that's kind of what I was feeling when I was watching it this time round.
I didn't get that. I can see why you would get that, but I didn't get that on rewatching it. I wonder if maybe you would have felt a more satisfying payoff if all of that reluctant hero stuff built up to a really satisfying climactic battle that used practical effects and models, because the effects are the most disappointing thing for me. So I like all of I like the performances. I really like Lance Guest. I think he's really likeable as both Alex and the comic relief duplicate made of him. But I agree to an extent that all of that reluctant hero stuff hinges on needing some dramatic payoff, which I think the CGI scenes don't deliver on. Like, I'm thinking of, when they deploy the death blossom at the end, and it's supposed to feel like quite a big moment, and it is just a spinning 3D animated object, essentially, with some lights coming out of it. So it doesn't quite deliver the visceral punch that good special effects can deliver to accompany narrative weight of what's the transformation that's happened in the Starfighter in this case.
Yeah, but I will say with that, and with that with the final act and all of that big battle scene, they are kind of fulfilling the premise with the title, because I was in two minds about this, because I'm so used to seeing space battles where you've got lots of ships flying around and it's this big moment. But in this, it literally is the Last Starfighter, and that puts it in the realms of like a Space Invaders or one of those old arcade games, which is so essential for this whole plot line. So I don't know if part of me was a bit like, oh, where are the rest of the ships? I want to see more people flying around. But it was literally just Alex, our hero, and he has to save the day with one ship and go up against an entire armada.
Yeah, and just in terms of how it's written by Jonathan R. Betuel, not sure how to say his surname. A recurring theme on this podcast. But it's written by Betuel.
We should do a supercut one day of all of our mispronunciations.
A deeply offensive supercut of all of the non-English names.
Maybe I'll park that idea for a while.
Anyway, in terms of the script, the way it captures that sense of being the Last Starfighter, I think that works really well and is making up for some of the lacking CGI. Because, for example, when Alex is formulating his plot and showing that he has a bit of a tactical mind, and he's not just good at playing a video game, when they're hiding in the asteroid and then they come up with their plan to sneak up behind the enemy, that's good writing within the framework of there only being this one plucky kid from Earth who comes up with a plan on the fly to destroy a whole fleet. And again, the CGI doesn't quite deliver on that moment, but it's a great performance. The interaction between Dan O'Hurley and Lance Guest as they're discussing the plan and formulating the plan, that's what makes it work, and that's what made it charming for me, and gave it that sense of weight to him being the Last Starfighter.
Yeah, and I think that charm also comes out in this cast. I think, like you said, the performances are really good and all of the character design's really fun. You mentioned Dan O'Hurley. Grig's makeup is amazing.
Yeah.
You've got Centauri. You've got Catherine Mary Stewart playing the love interest. All of these people which Nick Castle's put together. Also, it feels like he's got a bunch of his mates to do it in some ways, because they're all people that he knows from other films.
Yeah, there's all these links, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah, so like Dan O'Hurley is in Halloween 3, and then you've got Lance Guest, who's in Halloween 2. The Halloween links, isn't it? It's all that kind of stuff.
I don't know if it would be Castle or Betuel, the writer, but the role of Centauri was written with Preston in mind. I don't know if they already had him on board before, finalising the script, or they just wrote it hoping they could get him. But he's perfect in this movie. This lovable rogue, this con man type character who's on the side of good, but possibly only on the side of good out of convenience or by chance, and could just as easily be a bit of a bastard, but actually very charming and steering Alex in the right direction eventually. He's brilliant in it.
The way his alien face coming about every once in a while.
Yeah.
So there's that moment when he's flying around in the, what do they call it? The Star Car, the sort of DeLorean ripoff that they're flying around in. When you see him, he touches his face and then his eyes are just in like a, I don't even know how to describe, a puddle on his hand.
Handkerchief type thing, right?
Handkerchief, yeah, that's it. So they're just like, you just got staring at that, and you don't get a good look at his face at that point. You just see this weird moment. You're like, what the hell's going on?
That scene awoke a different childhood memory in me, a really terrifying one of some kind of alien abduction show, one of those like true stories of alien abduction type shows, or like fact or fiction, like that Jonathan Frakes thing, something like that dramatized a similar thing with an alien abduction and taking off the face. I can't remember what it is, or it might be from a different film, but it really like chilled me to my bones. Like it was just something so creepy about the way he takes his face off. Apart from that, he's a brilliant, charming and fun character. And he's such a silly, fun character that the film gets away with, an absolute cardinal sin of killing off a main character for emotional weight and then very casually bringing him back in the last scene and just saying, like, I didn't really die, I'm fine.
It was all a lie. I was regenerating.
Yeah, Robert Preston, he's so cheeky, he's so funny that it's completely forgivable to have a ridiculous scene like that at the end.
Yeah, and going back to the other characters as well, like Catherine Mary Stewart is interesting as the sort of love interest. How did you feel about the sort of romantic angle that they threw in? It felt like it wasn't too forced, but there is the moment at the end where he's like, right, you're coming with me now. I'm going to go and fly off in the spaceship, and you need to come with me because what else are you going to do? I was a bit like, she's kind of got her own choice here.
She's got her own choice, and also Alex is projecting his own kind of disappointment with trailer park life and his big dreams to escape the trailer park and make it and do something with his life. He's projecting all of that onto Maggie in a slightly pressurized way. But I think they're a good couple. I think there's like genuinely good chemistry between the actors, and even saying that, like, most of her screen time is spent with the doppelganger, so it's kind of comic relief scenes and it's not very serious, and all of the chemistry that they build up is with a character that's not actually her boyfriend. It's a replacement. So it's surprising that all of that stuff works well, but I think it's handled well. A lot of that was just shoved in after the fact because test screenings were like receptive to Beta Alex. They were like, we need to do reshoots, we need to get more Beta Alex scenes in. And for my money, it works really well because Lance Guest is very funny as Beta Alex. He's got great comic timing, playing off himself and just playing as Beta Alex as the kind of Mork type character, fish out of water guy. He's great fun.
Yeah, because they brought Lance Guest back, didn't they, to do more of those shoots, but his hair, he changed his hair or something, so a lot of it is him wearing a wig.
He's also really sick, I think. He's really
he's really
physically
sick
ill.
as well.
I mean, fortunately,
you shouldn't
laugh. I mean, he's okay, he's fine now. I don't know if you've seen a recent picture of Lance Guest, but he's aged like a fine wine.
Has he?
Yes.
What a guy.
Yeah, I recommend looking him up. He's absolutely gorgeous. But it doesn't matter that he kind of looks incredibly weird in those reshoots because we've already seen what the beta looks like before it takes Alex's form. It's terrifying and sticky and boggly eyes. So it works perfectly well that he wouldn't look totally normal and like Alex.
Yeah, talking about the goggly eyes as well and everything, and all that made me think about the character designs. So when Alex goes up to the spaceship and he meets all of these alien creatures for the first time, he can't understand them, right? Then he gets this little chip, the kind of Babel fish, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy kind of thing.
Isn't it?
Exactly. So then he can understand how they all speak and everything. But then in the final scene, when they go back, Maggie and everyone can understand Grig. So does Grig know how to speak English?
I don't know.
Yeah, that was just me finding one little bone of contention with the film.
Yeah.
It got me thinking that moment.
No, I don't know about that. Maybe Grig is wearing one, but then that wouldn't make sense because they could all be wearing one when Alex first shows up.
Let's just say that Grig was doing Duolingo on the ship flight down.
It seems like everybody he knows is dead, so it's in his interest to maybe learn an Earth-based language based on what they need to do to rebuild the Starfighter fleet.
But doesn't he say his family are enslaved by the evil empire?
I know he talks about having a clutch of 6,000 children or something like that. I can't remember. I didn't know they were enslaved. That's horrible.
Yeah, clutch of 6,000 kids.
Speaking of the Empire, there's a character that we haven't touched on, which is Norman Snow's performance of Zur, the main bad guy of the film. If you thought Robert Preston was delivering a fantastic performance, Norman Snow is chewing the scenery in every moment on screen, and I thought he was absolutely brilliant in it.
Yeah, he's quite camp, isn't he, in his performance
Extremely,
as well.
Yeah.
He's very space opera.
Very space opera, a perfect Ming the Merciless type performance that really holds the film together. To have a bad guy like that in a space opera, as we've seen, is very, very important. And he's brilliant.
And he just seems so clueless throughout the entire thing. He's got his little scepter as well, which he just waves around. All of these little elements that just make him seem a bit bumbling in his command over this empire.
Yeah, but again, they keep that tone very light and appropriate for the film. But again, bubbling away under the surface is the plot, basically, which is that he's the son of the leader of the Starfighters and is broken away from Rylan, the Rylan world or territories, and is willing to kill all of them, I guess, and just, exterminate vast swaths of life within his former home, basically. So he's pretty psychotic underneath that extremely camp, larger-than-life performance, which is an awful lot of fun. Again, just bubbling away under the surface, a very dark plot.
Yeah, all of that stuff that is happening under the surface of the film is quite an interesting aspect of it, because even just looking at the setting of putting Alex in a trailer park as well, I think that's so important to the rest of the film, because at the time there were lots of films which were showing suburban neighborhoods, and all of these characters were coming from there, like E.T., Flight of the Navigator, all of those kind of films. It's always suburban households, but showing a kid who's living in a trailer park, I think it's just showing a different group of people. And also just the community element that they all have, I think, is interesting. I mean, when Alex gets the high score, everyone in this trailer park comes out and it's like, oh my God, he's going to get the high score. I just can't believe there's that many people that are living there that want to see some kid get the high score in a video game as well.
Yeah, that scene stood out to me when it first came out, because it seems absolutely mad. But on reflection, I think it's a very good scene for setting the tone of the film, because the film really leans into the fantasy side of things and the silliness of it. And like I said, it maintains that tone throughout. So I think that scene's actually really important for setting that tone early on, because I'm sure even in 1985 that would have been an insane concept that dozens of people would crowd around a teenager getting the high score on a video game. Like, why do they care? It's absolutely mad. But it's kind of tongue-in-cheek and funny, and it sets that tone early on, I think, and I think it's a good choice.
I think it's just because they're all absolutely losing their minds over it.
Yeah.
Like there's a few characters that are playing like cards or something, and they hear about it and they drop everything they're doing just to run over and see what's going on.
But it's little flourishes like that, which is what I mean about the film really leaning into the silliness of it. So it's not just a scene where everybody in a trailer park comes to watch Alex win. They are coming with gusto and stopping what they're doing, and it's all incredibly over the top. And again, it's quite camp, isn't it? And it's perfect for a space opera. That's the tone that Nick Castle is trying to set early on. And interestingly, this has been adapted into a musical as well. I do kind of feel like
about this.
It lends itself to that. It's so camp that you can lean in even further to the campiness. I mean, this has an incredible score, so removing the score sounds mad, but to sort of lean into the more camp side of things even further and actually turn it into a full-blown musical seems like a good idea. I did listen to the first song.
Is it available?
The whole soundtrack's on YouTube. Yeah, you can check it out. You know how sometimes in a musical the first track just like, it's a standalone song, but it's also like an overture that captures everything and just like brings you into the world of the musical, and it's just an amazing song, that kind of feeling.
Yeah.
It's absolutely nothing like that. It's a really bad song and I didn't want to listen to it anymore. But I like the idea of turning it into a musical, it seems like a good idea.
Oh, amazing. I'm too intrigued not to listen to it though. Yeah, it's funny all the stuff that's sort of sprung off the back of this as well, because you would also think that naturally it's about video games. There would be a video game that comes off the back of it. And I think there was an initial one on the Atari when it came out. But the big one everyone always talks about is the one released in 1990, which was on the NES. And it turns out that was actually just a remake of a game called Iridium.
Okay.
So you play it, and it's a starfighter in space, but it's not really got anything to do with the Last Starfighter. It's just a remake of this game, but they've marketed it with the Last Starfighter like movie poster and everything, so it looks like it's part of that world. But yeah, stuff like that is just...
You can get away with that shit in 1990 on the NES, can't you? Like,
yeah.
I think they would have been... I don't know if they would have been better off making the game in the film instead of a game based on the plot of the film. I don't know. Well, it would have been the same anyway, I suppose, wouldn't it? But that seemed like a missed opportunity. There's a lot of missed opportunities franchise-wise here, because it feels like it's a very imaginative sort of idea that I can see captivating audiences. It didn't make a ton of money, and that might be why we haven't seen more of it. But I'm shocked there never was a sequel, and that they languished in trying to get a sequel made. And, you know, it seems like fertile ground for making more, because the ending, you know, lends itself to an obvious sequel, doesn't it? Alex developing a school and academy of starfighters.
Yeah, and I think a lot of directors were in the running to make a remake of this, because I think it's an idea that you could see being remade, but then I don't know how effective it would be nowadays, because you get something like a Gran Turismo, which is being made. So is it just the same kind of story, just retooled again by redoing Last Starfighter? I don't know if it would work as well, but it's such an interesting concept, just a kid playing a video game and then ends up not in the video game, but the video game's real and he's living it. He's living out that fantasy.
I think because video games have got so much more advanced and so much more realistic, that the proposition of the film becomes more realistic. For example, it's happened in real life with Gran Turismo, and so that's a more realistic film about that story, but with race cars, fun. But so I think that the tendency, if you were going to remake this, would be you'd be led by how realistic the game would be, and then you'd kind of be forced to create a more realistic film or a less camp, silly film. And I think it would just lose all its heart, because I can't see like Alex being a teenager who's very good at, for example, like a very realistic flight simulator. Like, you know, have you played that Star Wars game where it's basically you're piloting the ship, and it's quite a realistic game. It's quite, I think,
Rogue Squadron.
Squadrons, yeah, Star Wars Squadrons. Yeah. I couldn't play it. I got like vertigo playing it, because like it's a first person piloting a ship game. But I could see like you know,
flight simulator. On
yeah,
Windows.
like that, but set in a sci-fi world. But imagine that, and then he gets recruited, and then I just don't imagine it being fun, you know, because he'd be playing a much more realistic game, so we'd be seeing a much more realistic like experience of him piloting that ship for the starfighters.
And I think that's the thing with space opera and video games. They have to have they need to be grand adventures in order to work, and that's why space opera works, is because it leans into that fantasy element. It leans into the absurdist nature of this kind of story, and they are grand in scope. So I think if you're doing some sort of video game incorporated into it, it needs to have that grand design. It made me think of, in a weird way, when you were talking, it made me think about Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story 2, when he's playing the video game of him fighting Zurg. I don't know, there's something about that, and how like he's playing a video game of this grand space opera scenario, and then later on he meets the toy version of Zurg. I could be going off on an absolute tangent here, but just I was getting flashbacks of that moment. But then you can just see how interlinked video games and space opera have become, but it's just, how do you put that together on screen?
Yeah, keeping it lighthearted, I think, is actually really important, because well, maybe now is a good time to move on actually and talk about a film that takes things more seriously. But I just think that like we've moved forward so far in video games that there's so much more realistic depiction of something that I think you're just saying something quite different, recruiting someone to do the thing that they're doing in the video game, because Alex's skills in Starfighter aren't quite the same as, for example, being good at Gran Turismo, which is essentially like being good at driving a real car if you've got all the gear to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think recruiting is the key word, isn't it? And that comes into play in the next film we're going to talk about, Ender's Game. Hey there, listeners. Have you ever wanted more than just our regular podcast episodes? Well, you're in luck.
That's right. If you're enjoying the show and want to support what we do, you can sign up to our Patreon by going to patreon.com/journey through sci-fi and get access to our regular bonus episodes.
We've got the Bad Movie Bunker over there, where we dive deep into the best of the worst and the worst of the worst in sci-fi cinema.
Bad Movie Bunker.
And if you've ever wanted to have a say on what we review, check out our Patrons Picks, where our patrons get to choose their favourite undiscovered sci-fi gems for us to dissect and discuss.
Patrons Pick. But that's not all, folks. We're always keeping our feed up to date with the latest in science fiction cinema. You'll get the freshest reviews, along with exclusive miniseries covering the biggest and best sci-fi franchises.
So if you're ready for an even deeper dive into our sci-fi universe, become a patron today and unlock exclusive bonus episodes that you won't find anywhere else.
We hope to see you there, but for now, let's get back to the episode.
If we're going to survive, we need a new kind of soldier. One who doesn't think the way we think. Fear the things we fear. One the enemy would never expect.
We need minds like yours, Ender. You'll be the finest commander we've ever trained.
So I'm not the first.
No. But you will be the last.
So Ender's Game came out in 2013, a long time after The Last Starfighter, but it's based on a novel by Orson Scott Card, which came out almost contemporary to Last Starfighter, I think the year after Last Starfighter. So the concepts are floating around at the same time, but it took a long time to come to screen, even though it was quite popular, big franchise of books over the years by Card. Were you familiar with Ender's Game and the whole franchise behind it?
So I'd only ever seen this film. I hadn't really heard much about the books. And the one thing I did know was the author, Orson Scott Card. I mean, he's been very controversial in his views on gay marriage and been quite outspoken about that as well.
Yeah, he seems like a sort of well-known bastard, really. I don't know much more about him beyond that, and I haven't read his books, and I'm not too inspired to be honest. So I don't know how much of that kind of his thoughts on the LGBT community come across in the books. There's nothing on it in here because there's no sort of relationship stuff really handled in the film, so it kind of steers away from any potential rough areas that might be apparent in Card's work, if he does bring that into his books.
Yeah, and of course we've got director Gavin Hood taking control in this one, and the power kind of lies with the producers as well. Still kind of muddies the water a little bit when you've got such a character who's behind the scenes creating the story, and I think it's important to reference that. But in looking at this film on its own as a piece of creative work, it's just a very interesting take on space opera, and it uses those video game elements, but it also grounds it in a darker reality than what we see in a lot of other space operas.
Yeah, we're picking up the plot. There's an awful lot going on, as there often is with movies certainly based on books, and especially based on the first book in a long series. Although this does seem to just be based on the first one, but there's we're picking up a lot of backstory straight away with something like 27 years after the events of a big war, or even more than that, many decades after a huge intergalactic conflict with some insectoid invaders trying to apparently take over the Earth. And jumping straight past that, we get to the conclusion that children must be recruited in order to defend the Earth from a possible attack from those same aliens.
Oh, it's the logical step, isn't it? Just get the kids to man the ships.
I'm detecting a note of sarcasm in your voice there, because the film never sold me on the idea that children should be piloting the ships. And I don't know if
They're
something...
the future, Matt. Children of the future.
I don't know if something's been lost in translation from book to screen, but I have no idea why. I can understand in the way that the society is depicted, this heavily militarized society on a constant war footing with an alien species. I can understand why that kind of a world would recruit children into the military industrial complex from the earlier stages of education, but with a view to like making them commanders as and when they're of an appropriate age. It just feels weird to have like 13-year-olds, like what's so special? Why couldn't they wait another 10 years and then, more training, more learning, more experience, and then deploy them into the battlefield? Why is it so important to get young teenagers in particular?
Well, I think that comes in later on in the film when you find out the motives behind what they're doing a little bit more in terms of manipulating these children.
So essentially it's because they're inherently more stupid than an older person.
Exactly right. And they're more malleable, so you can get them to do what they want.
Yes, fair enough, yeah.
Yeah, which is very dark to say the least. And I mean, the themes in this book, I think it was banned in a number of schools because of, I don't know, there's lots of different reasons, but obviously it's got themes of child exploitation, genocide, there's lots of militarism, dystopian. In its like any dystopian book, there's a chance that it's going to get banned in a school. I mean, you look at The Handmaid's Tale and all of the plethora of films and books that we looked at in the previous series when we covered dystopia. There's something that the powers that be get a little bit nervous sometimes when there's a dystopian piece of literature in the mix.
Kind of. I can see that, but then a lot of those like dystopian books then get unbanned or never get banned, and they come around and then they get reappraised and they're used as teaching tools. Like 1984 gets taught in schools, Handmaid's Tale gets taught in schools. All of these things get taught in schools. What I found interesting was I read somewhere that this book is or was like required reading for the US Marine Corps, which is a very different audience. When educators pick up a dystopian novel and say children need to understand the themes of this book, I think that's quite interesting. Well, it says a lot about the content of that book that teachers want young minds to be shaped by it. But when the actual military is picking up a book and saying we want our young minds, our new recruits, to be shaped by this book, that says a very different thing about the content of the book. Basically, it's obviously they don't see it as critical, I guess, of the idea of recruiting young children basically to fight a war and be manipulated into fighting a war.
Yeah, because I don't know what the reading of the book is like, but in the film, the first message that comes up is, in order to understand your enemy, you must love your enemy, or something like that, or you will love your enemy by the time you've finished the battle, or something along those lines. I don't remember it verbatim, but understanding your enemy and realizing that they are the same as you in a lot of ways. Whereas it seems like if it's being used with the Marines and in the military, this book, there's another reading of this where you can view it as force is the only way to stop a war from happening or continuing. You have to use excessive force to completely obliterate your enemy. So that's a whole different reading of this book and film.
Yeah, so the quote is, "When I understand my enemy well enough to defeat him, then in that moment I also love him," which is attributed to A.E. Wiggin, which is Ender. But I think the first time you see the film, if you are not familiar with the book, then that sounds like it's like a quote from a philosopher or military tactician. But it's literally just a quote from Ender from about halfway through the film. He says it to his sister, doesn't he? Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost a Dune type thing to throw in a quote from one of the characters that's going to be said later on, as if the story itself becomes a historical artifact within the universe. And also there's something about empathy and understanding of one's enemy that relates to Paul's experience a little bit in Dune, but in a different way and for different reasons. But yeah, like that's the core concept. And it's interesting that they throw it up at the start as well, because it's a realization that Ender comes to throughout the film. And there's elements of how much the audience knows at the start of the film as well. I don't know if in the book you know that he's really fighting for real. I don't know if that's how it's presented, but they obviously don't want to present it that way in the film, and they hold it back to be like a twist. I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure the book runs along the same sort of themes, because you need to have that weight to it.
But putting that quote up at the start, in any case, kind of telegraphs where the story's going a little bit. That like we have this setup of bringing the kids in to help fight a war against this alien species, but the opening quote says that, you know, if I'm to be good at my job as a military leader, I must actually understand my enemy so much that I love my enemy. So it creates a bit of tension at the start where it's like, well, I don't think this is going to end in a massive conflict then, because I feel like I know what the theme of the film is going to be about, and sets up some expectations there that do come to pass, basically.
Yeah, I think that's important just in the character arc of Ender as well, because he's a young kid trying to find his way in this forced military environment that he's been thrown into. And obviously he wants to do his bit, because everywhere in each of the scenes, like there's a scene right at the beginning when he's at school, and there's all this propaganda about this alien invasion that happened, and it's like never again, this massive terrorist attack. So you've got all of that weight to everything that he's doing, and his family had him as a third child, which his only real purpose was to try and get into this battle school and then be of service to the military, really.
Yeah, it's pretty grim. It put me in mind of Starship Troopers, but kind of without the sense of humour, right? Because we have this insectoid race that has attacked Earth and then left Earth's politics to develop into a sort of military fascist international state that exists only to basically further those ends of the military to combat this force. That was another thing that kind of, to me, was also telegraphing that like things weren't going to play out in a straightforward way, because as soon as you make the connection to, or as soon as you notice any similarities to Starship Troopers and you're thinking about Starship Troopers, you're then thinking like, well, is this enemy as bad of an enemy as we're being presented by this very biased in-universe presentation, and the sort of essentially unreliable narrators of characters who've grown up in a world where all they know is they must train to defeat an enemy that they've never met.
And again, when you look at Starship Troopers, written by Robert A. Heinlein, so that book, very much hard sci-fi, and then that interpretation of the book is very different to how Paul Verhoeven put it on screen. He made it much more satirical and changed a lot of the sort of sensibility of that film. So it's interesting seeing how these controversial books have been thrown onto screen, and then the sort of subtle changes that are needed to make it palatable to audiences.
I'm kind of interested to read the book here. I think that so much has been said and written about Starship Troopers and Heinlein as well, that's a very famous story about that Verhoeven was from the outset setting out to kind of satirize the book and not lovingly adapt it for sure. Whereas I don't know what the intention behind this film is. And I'm actually quite interested to know what Orson Scott Card's opinion of child exploitation is. Basically, like, is he in favour of recruiting young children to fight in a war, or does he think it's a bad thing, or is it more complicated? Is it like necessary evil, blah, blah, blah? I don't know where this film sits, to be honest with you. Well, no, sorry, I do know where the film sits. The film is against it, but it would be interesting to know where the book lands on that, and whether Ender's journey is a worthwhile, journey.
Yeah, and it's weird when you think about what audience this is targeting as well, because it must be targeted at a teen audience.
Yeah.
So teenagers watching this film thinking, like The Last Starfighter, oh, wouldn't it be cool to be in space and be in a battle academy? But the way that everything's depicted, it's not that kind of film. It's It's the realities of war, and it's much more grim than you would first imagine seeing this film from the outset. I mean, I remember when the trailers came out, and it looked like this big space action adventure with teenagers fighting, and you've got a certain expectation of what that would be based on space opera as a subgenre. So I think it's interesting just seeing how that went into putting this film together.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think that's where the film loses it for me really a bit, because there's a midway point where Ender tries to quit and goes back to Earth and gets talked back into to continuing in the battle school. That marks the split between games and false games. So before that, he's in the academy, and then he's in the battle school, and he's doing kind of sci-fi combat sports with freezy guns, and reminded me a bit of Blitzball from Final Fantasy X, and and Rollerball a little bit as well. It's got that kind of element to it, which I think targets the age demographic that you were talking about, and has that kind of Last Starfighter fantasy element. And then it switches to the scenes where he's actually being openly, not to him, but increasingly to the audience, openly manipulated into fighting a real war with what he believes to be very realistic simulations of actual warfare, but are actually just a proxy war directed by him from afar. And that's when there's a huge tonal shift, because it builds up to that ending that he's been manipulated all along and manipulated into committing genocide. There's these two halves of the film that do not sit together for me. They feel like two different movies.
Yeah, and that gamification you mentioned just then as well, when they're at the Battle Academy and they're playing that game in zero gravity, that made me think of like the Harry Potter comparisons as well, because it's basically like they're playing some sort of Quidditch almost, but with space guns.
Yeah.
And then if you throw that into the comparisons, they're in this school where they're in different houses. You've got like the dragon group, you've got the salamanders. So they're sectioning them off like they did in Harry Potter, and they're playing this game, and everything is made to seem, although it's sort of they're in the military, it's still kind of like these are kids in a school, and that kind of angle is there. But as it develops, it just gets more and more bleak. I mean, the books are even bleaker though, aren't they? Because in the books, I think Ender is 6 at the start of this.
Oh, right. Okay. So all of that, the fighting and the like killing his classmates. Oh, he doesn't kill him in the film, but...
He doesn't in the film, but he does kill both of the fights he gets into. He kills both of those kids in the books.
Yikes.
Which is, horrendous. That kind of goes to show the kind of the force that he has is instilled in him as part of this military group and all of that. And then, being raised from the age of 6, and then I think he gets to the age of 13 during this academy or something like that. I don't know exactly, but having that from 6 to 13, and then when you throw it on screen as the film, I think there must be like 15, 16-year-olds in the film. So it doesn't show just how bleak the idea is in the original book.
Yeah. I mean, it tries to capture some of the brutality of life in the battle school with those fights. But it is it's interesting that those characters die in the book, especially Bonzo, because that's a pretty good scene where where he cracks his head, basically getting a fight and he cracks his head. And, it's this sort of realization of how brutal life is. And it feels like a moment that should puncture the fantasy of it for Ender a little bit. But then they kind of back away from that by saying like, he's fine, he's going to go back to Earth. They may be lying to Ender, to be fair, but that's what he's told, is that like, he can no longer be in the battle school, but he has survived the fight. He's not dead. It's a bit of a shame to back away from that, because actually the brutality is kind of the point, isn't it?
Do you think it's with having that brutality in it either way, like even though these characters don't get killed off in the film, having that grounded nature to it, making it more gritty, is that taking away from the space opera of it all And is that an issue with this film? Because if you make the Harry Potter comparisons again, it's Harry Potter is a fantasy adventure. This is a space adventure, but the stakes are much higher because of all of the manipulation and the dystopian elements of it. Do you think that's an issue with this being potentially a space opera film?
I don't know. It feels like an issue in this film, and I feel like it's something that doesn't work. I think that it's the problem with the two halves of the film. I think it would have been a better film if it leaned in more to the brutality of it as it stands, and especially comparing it today to The Last Starfighter. It does sort of feel like moving away from the inherent silliness of space opera, or at least not silliness, but lightheartedness and charm of space opera detracts from it. But I don't think that's inherent. I don't think that's an inherent problem with space opera. I think it can be done, but I just don't think this film manages it. For example, like there are moments in the second half that I think are really cool. I like the idea of remote commanding a fleet while also trying to like deal with the psychological consequences of that. I was reminded a little bit of Legend of Galactic Heroes, where you've got, you know, you've got the kind of like real stories of the individuals on the ground or in the ships. You get moments of that, but the main plot is actually about the commanders who are making decisions from afar. So that balance is really nice in Legend of Galactic Heroes, and they didn't quite do enough of it here. So it's almost like it's just not doing enough of either thing for me.
Yeah, because that whole second half where Ender he thinks he's in command school and he's taking control of this fleet in a simulation, and then they pull the rug from under him towards the end and say, no, actually, every single time you've been in this simulation, you are really fighting a battle. You are controlling our fleet. And that makes the stakes so much more higher. And by having these kids, this is what I was alluding to at the start of it, by having kids do it, they're guilt-free because they don't see it. They don't see what they're doing. They are playing a game. So they're playing the game to win. And it's a video game to them. So if you're playing a video game, you're not worried about the grand scheme of it. You want to win each level, but sometimes you will make choices that you wouldn't make in a real life scenario, which is what the military people want them to do. So they are taking more risks and they are doing things that would not be practical if this was a real life situation. And all of that gamification of war again is an interesting aspect of it when you compare it to something like The Last Starfighter, where you become the Last Starfighter. You are this rogue vessel fighting against the Empire, but you've got all the power and you are going to win. In this, you're dealing with real lives, so the jeopardy is so much higher, but in order to get around it, we're just not going to tell you. It's all just a game.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. It sounds like, from what you're saying as well, it sounds like you're quite sympathetic to Ender at the end of the film. Because one thing that I came out of it with maybe a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth was how I felt about Ender in the final act of the film. And I don't want to judge him too harshly as a character because he's very young and he's obviously manipulated by all the adults in his life in a really horrible way. But I just wasn't quite sure like what Ender wanted to get out of the command school and what his end game was. Because my understanding of what's going on in that final scene is that he believes he's in a simulation, and the simulation is a test. And if he passes that test, he will be given real life command of a fleet to join the fight against the aliens. So what would he have done? So you're saying that like it's a gamified environment, so he is making choices that he wouldn't make. But like so what would he have done? In his mind, he's in a test to show his capability as a command leader. So that, to me, says that he does think it appropriate in a command situation to sacrifice 1,000 lives and destroy an entire planet. And I appreciate that. I don't know. So it's more, I guess it is more about this gamification and you're making different choices and he's being manipulated. But I was thinking like, well, you know, he intended to get a real job off the back of this. So how would he act as a military leader? Why would it be any different?
There's all these elements in the film where he is doing what they want him to do. They tell him that you have to win by force. So he's always thinking about things in that strategic manner where you have to end the war, end the game by being the strongest player on the board, and that means doing the things that inflict the most damage. Like even when he's playing that Mind video game on his like little iPad, and he has to pick between the two poisons. They try to see how he deals with frustration, and they're both full of poison. So what does he do? He eats this giant's eye in this video simulation. He uses force to get through it, and he says afterwards, "That's what they want me to do, so I'm going to do it." But I see your point, the fact that he's still doing what they want him to do because that's what he thinks he's supposed to do. But he either way is going to be in a situation where he's going to have to deal with the real life consequences of doing these things.
Yeah, he's choosing brutality at every turn, and he seems aware of that. He seems aware that that's what they want. So he's even a little bit aware of a degree of manipulation, not the full extent of it throughout most of the film, but he's obviously aware of it to a degree. But it's part of his character that he's pushed towards his own brutal nature, but he also embraces his own brutal nature. I guess, I mean, to be honest, it makes him a more interesting character, but it makes him a character that I can't fully get behind. And I'm, like I said, I'm not motivated to read all of these books, but I can see that there's potential there for this character to be a bit more interesting because, you know, he's this character that I don't fully trust or like because he readily embraces all this brutality, but then he ends the film saying that he's got to carry the weight of genocide for the rest of his life, which is, you know, so he's obviously reflecting on that in the closing scenes of the film, which is a good indication for him as a person. But I think there's a lot going on there, and I do think that there's potential to explore that in other stories.
But that's exactly how Yamato ends as well, isn't it? Because the lead protagonist of that kills an entire planet.
Yeah.
So it's the same premise, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and then immediately has to deal with the psychological implications of that.
Yeah, it's very dark. I mean, is this even really space opera when it comes down to it? I think in a lot of ways it's more of a dystopian, hard sci-fi in some aspects, but I still think it's been marketed as a space opera.
I think that it feels like it moves into space opera territory in the second half of the film. There could have been a lot more of that, and it's much more on the military sci-fi end because it's just a lot more serious in tone and in its approach to science fiction concepts. But I think that we talked about it before, particularly with Legend of Galactic Heroes and a few others, that military sci-fi and space opera are two ends of a spectrum of seriousness, but they are, I think, very closely related. And in that second half in particular, I think that it becomes a space opera, and it has this whole space opera background going on with the kind of clash of two enormous fleets in space, or impending clash anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree with that because that's what makes a space opera as well. You've got an evil empire, whatever that face may be for the evil empire, and then there's a struggle and there's a rebellion and there's a war and all of that stuff's happening in the background. And you've got a protagonist who is plucked from obscurity and made to be the leader of this battle. There's not really there's no love story in this. There's no romantic angle. You've got Haley Steinfeld's character, who is thrown in there towards the end of it almost. And you've got sort of like an ensemble cast of other kids around Asa Butterfield's character of Ender, who are there to kind of make him potentially seem a bit more sympathetic at times. Like he makes friends with one of the bullies. And then there's the character of Bean, who's this smaller streetwise kid who he kind of makes friends with. And there's all these like little relationships that he sort of starts up. But I don't know how they kind of develop. They develop in an all right way. It's kind of like his classmates, but there's always that kind of you can't quite gauge what Ender really is like throughout a lot of this.
Yeah, he's a weird character.
He's a weird kid.
He's a weird kid, but that is deliberate, and I think that they have at least succeeded. I think that's one of the better aspects of the film is, I guess, I was complaining about how I didn't know what to feel about Ender by the end of the film, but that does show that, like, it's a good performance by Asa Butterfield. He's a good actor, and he had a few good turns when he was very young as an actor. He's very talented, and to kind of capture that weirdness and outsider kind of nature of Ender, I think they've done a really good job of doing that.
And then you've got sort of the clash between Harrison Ford and Viola Davis's characters of who's in charge and how we're supposed to treat these kids. I quite like that kind of dynamic between the two of them. I mean, Harrison Ford is always good as a grumpy old man, and that's exactly what he's doing.
Yeah, and Viola Davis is excellent as well. I felt both characters were just underexplored and underexplained, which is a shame because they have two great actors working on that. To say nothing of Ben Kingsley, who, one of the greatest actors who just only has one interesting scene in the film when he's first introduced and then kind of fades away. So I don't think they make use of their adult cast very well.
Yeah. And then amongst all of this, you've also got this alien race and how we're perceiving the aliens in this. And I think, like you said, that's where it gets a little bit more in the realms of space opera, because you've got this alien race who are faceless. They're the faceless empire at the start of it, but they slowly fill in the grey areas of this alien race as we start to explore, okay, so what are your enemy like? And Ender makes lots of comments about, like, I have to know my enemy in order to understand them, in order to beat them. And when he starts kind of really thinking about that, you start finding out more about these aliens and the threat they pose.
Yeah, I think they're a great species. I like the fact that it's very similar to Starship Troopers. I like an advanced insectoid army with a sort of collective consciousness. I think it's a great, really classic sci-fi concept for the villains, and even better to make them not villains like Starship Troopers does, and like this film does as well. I think it's great. I think it's a shame that we don't see more of it, because a lot of it didn't make sense to me. Like, for example, like, I didn't realise, were we supposed to know that the character in the video game was one of the Formics, are they called? It was a queen, I think, supposed to be in the game.
Yeah.
But like, I didn't really clock the relationship.
Yeah, I think it's so brief the way they do that. I think they could have explored that more, but that's one of the moments that stuck with me, because it's the second time I've watched this. And I do remember being really struck by it, just because I think when I was first watching it, it was so unexpected, all those weird turns in the game, and it kind of threw me a bit off balance. But they could have fleshed out a bit more. I think a few more meetings in the game would have just helped it. But again, the whole film rushes to its climax.
Yeah.
You've got this first half, sort of everything's like a slower pace that he's developing in this battle school, and then suddenly he's in command school, and suddenly he's doing the simulations, and then like suddenly mass genocide. Absolutely breakneck speed, it feels like.
Yeah. It's I don't think it quite lands what it's trying to land. Like I was saying, I think that, like, it doesn't have the charm of Last Starfighter, and it misses out on that necessary charm of a space opera, but then it doesn't lean enough into the seriousness of the second half. I think either of the two halves of this film should have been extended to a full film, be it the games in space and the sports that he plays, and target it to a younger audience, or extend out the kind of latter half where things get more serious and more Legend of Galactic heroes directing battles across space from a proxy room. But it just doesn't, like, succeed on either front, unfortunately. It just misses both marks for me.
And I think, looking at it as well, and just in terms of the themes and all of this intense military background that's happening, the closest thing we've seen have all been in Japanese anime, haven't they? All of this kind of like space opera in a military setting.
Yeah, it's interesting that we haven't come across more serious Western space opera. I suppose Titan AE is like the closest, but that's kind of it also goes pretty hard on the cartoony stuff. Yeah.
Insectoid race in that again.
But we have the kind of silly cartoon aspects and the kind of gargoyle type characters that bring it back to light-hearted fantasy. But it'll be interesting to see more of these as we go along in the series, the kind of more in this dark and gritty era of modern filmmaking, the approach to space opera in that sense.
Yeah, will it come back again as we delve further into space opera throughout the series?
So I think we're definitely going to be looking at a few of them in future. But before we do that, we're looking at a different kind of space opera revisionism next time on the show. What have we got lined up next time, James?
Oh, we've got an absolute treat for your ears next time on the podcast. We are delving back into Star Wars. Of course we are. It's space opera. You know we're going back there again. This time we're going to be looking at the prequels, the Lucas era of the Star Wars franchise. I'm excited and dubious about this one, Matt.
So I think that's the appropriate attitude to have approaching a rewatch of the Star Wars prequels. I'm excited. I think there's an awful lot to talk about in these films, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation, James. I'm happy to sit through 6 hours of Star Wars prequels to get there.
Midi-chlorians.
Oh,
and
yes.
I'm hoping you'll throw in a few Jar Jar Binks impressions throughout the next episode.
I don't think so, mate.
Yeah, it will be an experience, as it always is when we cover certain films on this podcast. But yes, look forward to that one coming into your feeds before you know it.
We'll be back soon, folks. Thanks for listening to this episode of Journey Through Sci-Fi.
You can find us at journeythroughsci-fi.com, where you can find links to our social media and join the conversation.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard and want to support us, why not leave us a review on your podcast app of choice? It really helps new people find the show.
You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where you can receive exclusive bonus episodes every month.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and we'll see you again next time for another Journey Through Sci-Fi.